All right, it looks like we're live. I think we can get started now. David, welcome. I'm going to turn it over to you in just a moment here. Give a few introductory housekeeping suggestions for those that haven't been with us today at other BB Dev Day sessions. Just a reminder, on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see the chat. You'll see a list of documents. So that's where the slides can be found from today's presentation. There's also a spot for Q&A, so feel free to put your questions in that chat, and we will call them up towards the end of the session or throw them in the middle if that makes sense. But with that, I will turn it over to you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kelly. So welcome, everybody. Today we are going to cover developing an add-in primarily for Raised Edge, but absolutely for Financial Edge as well. There's no reason why you can't. So some of these sort of skills labs, some of these sessions that I've been to in the past, you'll see someone frantically typing away code, trying to demonstrate what they're doing by doing it live. I am definitely not going to do that for several reasons. One, I don't type that well. And two, I really think it's very boring watching someone type. So I put together a whole lot of slides here, which I'm going to go through. And my thoughts are really that the takeaway, the handout, will be your guide. It's a copy of the slides, but it will be your guide as well. So what we're going to cover, I'm not going to go into detail of every single item on every single slide. But when you do want to implement this yourself, you do want to work through yourself, hopefully be able to follow the slides, go through them step by step, as I'm doing now, and put together your project, your add-in for Raised Edge or Financial Edge. So it's been relatively fast-paced. There's a lot to cover, well, let's get cracking. So what are we going to cover today? Let me just work out. There we go. So we're going to look at setting up a front-end Angular project. We're looking at the back-end, the server side, C# project. We are looking to push the server-side code out to AWS Lambda, using AWS Amplify to host our front end, the website bit, if you like. And with that, we're going to be using continuous integration. Then we will work on setting up a Blackbaud developer app. And then finally, hopefully, it all should work. That's the idea. It should be a tile on Raised Edge, specifically on a constituent record. So what we're going to be using when we do this, well, you can use very many different tools, and you can use different languages. You don't have to use the tools that I'm suggesting. This is what I'm going to be showing and demonstrating. So I'm going to be using Visual Studio 2022 for my server-side C#, Visual Studio Code for the front-end Angular. Now, I know you can use both products to cover both areas, but I like that separation, and I'm just quite used to working like that with two different products for different types of languages. Then we have GitHub for source control. Again, you can use different source control, and I think it probably works very well, integrates nicely with AWS as well. And as it's all about AWS, or at least we're pushing to AWS, we're using AWS Amplify for the front-end hosting and Lambda for the server-side hosting. Again, I've used Azure for both those things as well, well, for the server side at least. So it's very much possible to use a combination of everything. And finally, of course, Raised Edge. Or, as I said earlier, Financial Edge, the principle is the same behind what we're doing here. So you can certainly create a tile in Financial Edge. I've just worked mainly with Raised Edge in my career. So that's why we're going to be focusing on that. So what are the assumptions we make about what you need and what you're going to be using? Well, as I said, I'm using Visual Studio 2022, although I think 2019 would work fine. As I'm sure a later version would also, if that comes out by the time you eventually go through this by yourself, or you look at it sometime in the future, I'm sure a later version will be fine as well. Again, I'm using Visual Studio Code. As I said, you can use a combination of either or both. We have a GitHub account. We have AWS account with enough access to be able to cover all the elements we're working with here. You can, of course, if you're just testing or just practicing or creating something yourself, use a root account or supervisor account. But I recommend in actual production not to do that, just to give yourself the access that you should sufficient. It's best practice to do that. Of course, Razor's Edge and a Blackbaud developer account as well. Right. So let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new Angular project. Now, I recommend that when you start working with Angular, just make sure that the version you choose to work with is supported by the Sky UX add-in client, rather. Blackbaud are quite good at keeping up to date, but there was occasionally a period of time when a new version of Angular is released and Blackbaud don't update the add-in, and so that it doesn't work. So there's a mismatch. So you need to just check before you start work. Just check that the version you are on Angular works with the current version of the add-in client. So we're going to create a new project, and we do ng new for that, and then we're going to install the Sky UX add-in client library using npm, and that just sets up our prerequisites and our project, so that once you've done that, we should have something in Visual Studio Code which looks like this. So this is basically the default without any of our own code written there at all. Hopefully this will be relatively familiar to you if you've worked with Angular projects before, and shouldn't be a shock to you. Blackbaud has documentation about how to set up an add-in project. I'm going to leave that, obviously that link will be there in the handout just for you to follow. It's worth looking. I mean, I haven't covered every single aspect of doing everything about an add-in or about setting everything up because there's so much documentation on Blackbaud's website already that it's worth looking at that in combination. I've tried to fill in some of the gaps where I felt that things are missing or where I needed extra help, but definitely worth looking at that link, just getting started, just to talk you through how to set things up. One of the aspects it talks about in that is setting up certificates for local testing. Without those, you can't, it just won't work. And Blackbaud did talk about that in the documentation, but one thing they don't do is tell you how to go about creating a certificate. And it's not that obvious or straightforward either, unfortunately. At least I didn't think so. So I've just put a link in here to a Microsoft site, which gives you information. There are references to Azure there, just ignore them. We only really want the certificates. The Blackbaud developer, the code, the documentation on the Blackbaud site tells you what to do with those certificates and how to add them and where to put them. But you do add them, as you can see there, under the SSL. You create the SSL folder and put the certificates there. And then you just update the Angular JSON file with references those certificates. Okay. So let's create a new component. First component for us. So we're going to create a bbdev tile component. So I do that with ng c bbdev tile. So that's ng Angular g generate c component. So we create our tile. I've used the flat and the skip test flags. The flat because I don't want it into a folder structure. I want it just put in that folder I'm currently in. And skip test because it's a very simple, very straightforward application. I feel it's overkill to have tests of the type they give you. But of course, you should decide whether you want to make use of all that or not. And the second component we're going to create here is a service using ng g generate s service and data as the name. And again, using the flat and the skip test flags. So the service is our it talks to our backend. So it calls all our backend endpoints, and we'll see an example of the code in those in a minute. So once you've done that, you should see those three, or in this case, the 4 components that have been created. the three BB Dev Days tile component files, HTML, the CSS, and the TypeScript files, as well as the TypeScript data service file. Right. So one little gotcha that I discovered, I had a long conversation with Blackbaud about for over a long period of time, was that I couldn't get the add-in to work. And we concluded in the end that for at least the current version of the add-in client service that we added in the very beginning, there was a prerequisite or a need to have the Sky theme service added as a provider. Now, even if you're not using it directly, at least at the time of presenting this and when I last used it, we definitely needed that. So that's just a little gotcha there, which no one told me about. It's not documented on the website, but it's definitely worthwhile knowing about. It might well be that that has been changed and it's no longer necessary, but if you are finding yourself getting into trouble and it's complaining about not being able to find things in the Sky theme service, then just add that as a reference. So next, adding some more code. We go into the app component file where we just put our routed outlet. So that's going to direct our code to be routed from that file. And then we're going to go into our data service. And this, as I said earlier, this is the file which talks directly to our backend code. So we have code in here which calls using HTTP service, calling our backend endpoints that we will create shortly. We're using an environment file for the base URL, and I will explain the reason for that shortly. We're putting that's where we'll put the base URL, which is where our backend endpoints reside, and obviously the path afterwards is depending on the endpoint itself. But I'll explain that in a minute. In fact, in this slide, I'll explain it. So the idea behind having an environment file is where we basically store constant variables, I suppose, or variables that don't get changed. And the idea behind that is that when we develop add-ins, we have three different environment files, or in fact, three different environments. We have a development, we have a staging, and we have a production. And in our development environment, we point to localhost. So that when we run this, we are running the localhost version of our server code, so that we can step through the code, we can put breakpoints, we can step through the code, and we can debug that way. When we get to staging and we're ready to test, but we're not quite ready to go live, we point to the staging endpoints. And then finally, obviously, we have the production environment, which points to the production endpoint. And you can put other things in there which are specific to the environment. It's a very useful way of working. And then finally, that's sort of tied into the Angular JSON where you have different builds. So we have a build for production, a build for staging, and a build for development. And as you can see on line 41 through to 46, what happens, if you can see that closely, what happens when you build it, it replaces the current environment file with the version from the configuration. So in this case, production. But obviously, if you're building a staging configuration, it will replace it with a staging one, or the development version. A very nice way of making it or changing the environment or changing the settings depending on which environment you're working with. So next stage is to add some code into our component, to the main component. So as you know, there are three parts to an Angular component, or potentially four if you're doing tests. The three parts is the TypeScript, and you have the template, which is HTML, and then you have the CSS. So we're only looking at TypeScript. The HTML is pretty standard, just displaying something. The TypeScript in this case, we make use of our add-in client service, and when we start, when the component is called, the add-in client service is called, and we subscribe to it, and we are returned the current environment ID and the record ID where the user finds themselves. I.e., if they're on my constituent record, will be sent the record ID of my constituent. So we have some information that tells us, okay, this is the environment or the environment ID of the person who's using Razor's Edge, which is dependent on the environment they're working in, the organization, roughly speaking, or if they have multiple environments, then perhaps their production environment or their test environment or different chapters within their organization. And then obviously record ID is the constituent in this case. If we're doing it, say for example, a tile on an action, then it would be the action ID rather than the constituent ID. And then finally, we want to get the user identity token from the add-in client service. We might want to do some more things with that and make use of that. Perhaps we want to convert it to get the user data themselves. But in this case, we are we then from that after that we go to our service components, our service, the data service, and we are retrieving subscribing to our data server data, getting our server data from our back-end server, which then will display on the front end. And when all that's done, we set our UI to show to make it visible. Now, obviously, you may want to look to see who is using this based on the information that's coming through, and to actually know that person shouldn't see the tile. So we're going to set our UI to false, and that way they won't see the tile. You might want to limit the tile, the visibility of the tile to certain users in an organization, and that's how you go about doing that. Okay. A final component we're working with is the routing of the component. So in this case, we only have one route, and that points to our component. But it's not impossible to imagine that you might have several tiles in a project, in which case you'd have several routes pointing to different components in the project. In this case, we're just having one route, and in actual fact, all the wildcards lead back to that component as well. Makes it very simple for us. But as I said, you can put other routes in there if you have multiple components. And then we're ready to commit this to GitHub in our case. And just so you know, all the code that I'm going to be showing is available in GitHub. And that when you get the handout, that link obviously is live. You just click on that link and you'll come to the GitHub where you can retrieve the code that's available. We're showing now. So we commit all the code to GitHub, and then we can carry on the next stage. I'm just going to take a glass of water to. Right. Now we move on to the backend. So as I said, I like to split up Angular and C# into two different IDEs. And I would like to develop C# in Visual Studio. And one thing I would say is definitely add the AWS toolkit to Visual Studio if you're working with AWS, because it makes life so much simpler. So you can find that in the extension manager. You just search for AWS toolkit and add that to Visual Studio. And I think there are versions that are going back, several versions of Visual Studio. So even if you're using an older version, you should be able to find it. So once you've installed Visual Studio, AWS Toolkit rather, you will see the AWS Explorer, and that shows you some, but not all of the components that are available on AWS. Now, I'm not certain how it is if you don't have rights to these components. It may well be you don't see them listed here, or it might just be that if you try to access them, it prevents you because you don't have rights. But even before you can access them, you have to set up a profile. Now, there are different ways of doing this. I'm not going to go into that detail because, well, for the honest reason, I don't know how to do it all the different ways that are available to you. But if you do, you can see I've got credentials there, and I set up a profile, a default profile. But if you click on the plus and the contact person symbol, then I'll create a new profile, and you'll get a box something like this. It can also be done via command line. But as I said, it's much simpler to do it in the AWS toolkit. As I said, there's different options, different profile types there. When I first started doing this, there was only one type available to me. and I just run with that. I think there's several types depending on how your AWS is set up. So you might want to just check out that user guide, or if you weren't involved in setting up AWS yourself, then maybe just speak to the person who was, so they can get some advice about how to set up your profile. Right. And then we're going to create a new project in Visual Studio. Now, obviously, because we've installed the toolkit, we now get a lot of different templates available to us, which is great. It makes life a lot simpler. I usually go with this, the Lambda ASP.NET Core Web API template. But in truth, once I've done that, I end up removing most of the code anyway. So if I do next, I just give it the name of the project, a location. So these are pretty standard fields that you normally always get. And then you'll get prompted to put in your profile name, the one you've just created, so that AWS knows where to look for your credentials, and also the region where you're going to be installing this as well. And then once you've done that, the code that gets, this is the default code that gets generated. It's quite good. It gives you examples of how the controller works and what to expect. And if you wanted to do some test runs just to make sure things work, it's quite a nice way of doing it. But I tend to just get rid of all of this. In fact, for this purpose, I've created a new controller. So I've created a data controller, which our front end will call. And essentially you just have one method here, so get, and you can see here the get, and we can see that the parameters are the environment ID and the record ID. In this case, I'm not actually using the environment ID, and the record ID is pretty arbitrarily used. As I said, in a real world example, you probably want to call some data from a database or from a third-party database, or you want to do something else more useful with this data rather than just doing like I've done here. But I will leave that more complex work up to you to decide how to do it. Right. So just one thing that I always add, and that is to make sure you manage CORS properly. So if you're not familiar with CORS, it is a mechanism to protect your server code or the API code. And there are many people out there that just say, oh, just do allow any header, allow any method, and allow any origin, because it doesn't really matter. And ultimately, if you're doing a test practice thing, it doesn't really matter because it's just a test. But that's really not at all a secure way of doing it. You do want to restrict who can access your API. How you do that depends very much on how you're working and what you're working with. But this is one method for doing that. And what I've done here is create a policy, allow specific users or allow specific domains to access the API. And this is well, we're setting the origin allowed as a method here. And in that method, we are passing back which origins are allowed, essentially. And in this case, I'm doing anything with the domain amplify.com. In a real world, or a better example, you probably narrow it down even further than that. Clearly, it's not that hard to imagine someone spoofing or creating a site hosted by Amplify just to access your API, if it's that they would want to do that. So you might want to actually put in the full domain there. And once you've done that, you then link it also in the configuration, just to say that you're using the allow specific process. Right. So once you've done that, we're going to commit that code to GitHub. Again, I've put the link up there where the code is located, and you can download that to have a look. There's not much to it really, but obviously it has the whole project there. It makes it slightly easier if you just want to run it through yourself. And then once you've done that, we are going to publish this to AWS Lambda. Now, it is possible to work with continuous integration with Lambda functions. I have to be upfront and say I've never done it before. For whatever reason, I've always done this publish, and maybe one day I will look into doing it more as continuous integration, more seamless, so just you commit it and it gets pushed out. But for now, I'm just doing publish to AWS Lambda. I've done it on Azure, It felt like the whole process was simpler, even though it's not that simple, but it is simpler. But on AWS, it seems to be a little bit more complicated, so I haven't really bothered or gone down that route. So anyway, when you do publish Lambda, it behind the scenes creates what's called a CloudFormation process. So it's a descriptive language in AWS, which builds everything you need, all the components you need to get your application to run. So in our case, we have the Lambda, the serverless functions in the cloud, and also an API gateway, and that's what we are setting up through this process. So when you do that, up pops this menu with the options, and again, it asks to select our profile, which we've done there, and the region. For the CloudFormation, so I talked about the CloudFormation settings, you need to specify a name for the CloudFormation stack, and also an S3 bucket where you will store the code temporarily, at least before it gets actually installed. S3, if you're not familiar with, is a way of storing objects in AWS, storing code, storing files, whatever it might be. It's just a storage mechanism. And yep, so then once you push that through, we can see that we have added our Lambda function to AWS. And that appears there in the list. We don't see API gateway. It's just doesn't appear in that list, unfortunately, but it is there. And we can see that by going online and seeing in the portal, AWS portal, we can see that here. So here we're looking at our application that was created. An application consists of the API gateway and of our Lambda function. So we need to go in to application to find out the URL for that. So if we go into the application, we can see the API endpoint there, and we'll copy that because we need that value to paste into our Visual Studio Code, into our Angular, so that our data service is able to call our backend endpoint. So we're going to plug that into our Angular environments file. In the base URL, we've plugged that in. So now we know that, so now that the data server knows exactly where to call the endpoint for the API. So now we are going to build our front-end hosting application. So AWS has a product or a component or an application called Amplify. And it can be used also for hosting backend code, but I tend to use Lambda for that, and just use front end hosted by Amplify. So when we start to create a new application on Amplify, we're given the option of selecting a source control or not. You can deploy just by uploading code as well, which I have done in the past, but I find that using it straight from source control is so much simpler and so much better. Of course, there are other source control options available to you there. I've not used them before, so we don't know exactly how they work. I presume they work in a similar way to GitHub, but I'll let you discover that yourselves. So we select GitHub. And then the first thing we need to do is to give AWS Amplify the rights to access our GitHub source code. So that's what we're doing here. We have to obviously log in, and we have to just authorize AWS Amplify to access our code. So you can go ahead and select all repositories, but as is always the case with security, it's best to limit what anything has access to. So I recommend you only select the repositories you're currently working with. Obviously, if you select all repositories, or if you just have one repository, then you might think selecting all repositories is fine. If I only have one, that's fine. But what that means is going forward, any new repositories you add will also be able to be accessed by AWS Amplify. Now, that may not be a problem for you. You may not think it's an issue, but my preference is always just to select the one project I'm currently working with. You can always add them later. If you do a new project, a new website, you can add more projects if need be. So next stage is we've linked our repository. We've selected our repository there from GitHub, and we have to decide which branch we're going to work with. Now, because I've just created this GitHub, just pushed from Visual Studio Code, there's only one branch, there's only master. But as I mentioned earlier, I tend to work with 3 different environments corresponding to 3 different branches. So that's development, staging, and master, or main, or production, whatever you want to call it. I think master comes by default in GitHub, or is it Visual Studio Code? I'm not sure. So we start with just the master, and then afterwards we can add the other environments, the other branches. So there are a few changes that we have to make here. We have to update our build settings. So the way that Amplify builds your project is through a YAML file. You'll see them in YAML. It's very simple syntax. There's not much to it if you're not familiar with it. It doesn't take much to work out what's going on. But you can always read up about it. It's not very hard. And the default just doesn't really work for our purposes. It might work in some cases for Angular, some Angular projects, but for a tile and when we have multiple configurations, you need to add a few more things. So let's just go ahead and edit that. So what I've done here is I have gone and added the configuration. So that line 9, where we have the npm run build, I think that's the original, and I've added configuration and there's an environment variable there. And in a minute we will populate that environment variable with production, meaning that corresponds to our Angular code where we said the environment was production. And we can do a similar thing then, different environment variables for production, staging, and development. And then line 14 also changed. We have to add on a path of the browser, which is something relatively new, but again, it just doesn't, it's the way that Angular is built in this later version of Angular that AWS hasn't really caught up with yet. It might well be that's the default later when you come to look at this, but we need to have that, the distribution folder with BB data, dev data 2025, and then the browser path. So that's our YAML file. So then we have one more advanced setting we need to change. So again, at the time of writing, AWS doesn't support Angular 19. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe they'll catch up. Maybe by the time you come to do this, they will support and it will work fine out of the box. But when you try to use a default build image that comes with it, there are errors. And what they quickly learn just by searching Google is that you have to have a custom build image, and that is the one that's the time writing is the latest one. No, it's 2017.0, or at least that's the days when I've been using. They seem to come out very regularly, so there might be a new one since that since this time. Right. So I mentioned earlier that as part of the build configuration, we have an environment variable. And in this first instance, we're going to use production because that's what we have. But as we add other branches, staging and development, we can create a new build environment variable connected to staging. And when you add the new one, it prompts you which branch do you want to tie this one to. So production is tied generally across the board when we only have one. But when you add a new one, it will offer you the chance to tie it to a specific branch rather than as a general rule. Obviously, you can't have two environment variables of the same key. So as a default, but you can have it for a different branch. So we'd have one later for staging and one for development. But this is the environment variable we saw in the YAML file. and it means that our configuration will point to production to start with. Right, so once we've deployed that, and hopefully everything works as expected, occasionally it does, we need to take out this URL here, the domain one, which is highlighted. And that is the URL of where we will view our front end. And that needs to be put into the Blackbaud developer app, so that the add-in, so that when we use our add-in, RaiserEdge knows where to look for the front end. And we will have a look at that now. So this is our Blackbaud developer app. You get here by going to developer.blackbaud.com, and then there's an option there to create a new app. And I've created one here, BBDevDays 2005, and you'll need to create your own. This is not going to stick around the whole time, but they're really straightforward to create. So you want to make a note to copy that application ID, which we'll use in a minute, and then used for one particular purpose. But also, you might very well want to, your tile rather, your add-in may very well want to read or write data back to and from RaiserEdge, in which case you will need to use the OAuth2 process to ask permission, or ask the user for permission to access their data. Just because you are a tile or an add-in in RaiserEdge doesn't give you automatically right to their data. You still have to ask permission. You still have to go through that OAuth2 process to ask for the user's individual permission. There's several reasons for that. One, because you have to ask permission, but also because you need to know, or you can only do things that user has rights to. So, for example, if a particular user only has read-only rights to RaiserEdge, and you want to write something back, that read-only person really can't use your app. And obviously, when they try to, there'll be errors because they can't write back. So it's a way of restricting who can access RaiserEdge, on top of the fact that the organization as a whole has to accept your app, and we'll look at that part in a minute. I have not included OAuth2 in this app, not because I don't want to read and write RaiserEdge, but there's a lot more to it, and also it's covered in great detail in the Blackbaud documentation, and there's a lot of information out there. So hopefully that shouldn't be too difficult to do, or is relatively complicated if you're new at doing it. All right. So the next part we want to do is add information about our add-in into our Blackbaud developer app. So we go to the add-in section of that previous screen, and we add an add-in. And for that, we paste in our URL that we copied previously from Amplify, and that is the one that's at the top there, amplify.com URL. We also select where we want it to appear. Now, obviously, development office constituent tile dashboard is where I've selected. That means that it will appear on a constituent record. But obviously, there's all different places where you could put it, including Financial Edge and grant making as well. So yeah, take your pick. Once we've created our app, we've saved all of that. The next stage is to authorize, or for your instance of RaiserEdge, or for another organization's instance of RaiserEdge, to authorize the use of your app. So this is separate from the OAuth2 process. This is saying that an organization, in general, an organization should be allowed to use your application. Now, if you are writing an application for your organization, there really is no need to put it in the marketplace, or to have access, or to have it approved to put in the marketplace. If you are a third party and obviously want to sell it to others, then you might want to go down the marketplace route. But in this case, and when you're testing at least, you simply go to the marketplace and go to manage, and you want to connect an application rather than select from or browse from the marketplace. So you're connecting your own application. You paste in the application ID, which we highlighted earlier. That's the same ID that you would use for the OAuth 2 process. Once you paste it in, it will populate this panel, and it'll show you the name of the, if it's found it correctly, if you've pasted it correctly, it'll show you the name of the application and some details about it. If it doesn't show you that, then obviously you can't find it and you've done something wrong. At that point, you can press the connect button, and that will connect your organization, your instance of Razor's Edge, to your application, and it will allow your application to be visible inside Razor's Edge on a tile. So that really is all there is to it. I say all there is to it, it's a lot, but from the steps you need to take, that's all there is to it. So did it work? Well, I'd love to say that if you followed everything I've done here step by step exactly, then it will work perfectly, but it probably won't. I mean, let's be honest, software development is difficult, and when there's so many different steps involved, there's always issues. So what do we do about that? Well, obviously we can debug the code. And how do we go about doing that? Well, there's different mechanisms for that. As I said earlier, we can use our amplifier in the environment build, or environment configuration. Sorry, use our development environment build of our Angular code, excuse me, and then that will point to our localhost version of our server code. So we can put a breakpoint in our server code if something isn't working there. We can, in theory, we can also debug our Angular code. However, you can no longer put localhost into an add-in as the URL. So what I've been doing is I have been putting setting up ngrok. If you're not familiar with it, just take a look. It's really straight. Well, it's a lot to it. It's a massive application, but I've used it in a simpler sense, just creating a tunnel back to localhost. I'm sure there are lots of other tools out there that do this. And what that means is you can put that, you can put an HBS ngrok domain URL into the developer app, and that will tunnel back to your local host. What that means is you can then write some debug code inside your Angular app, some console logs, and rather than having to commit it to amplify the whole time and have it build and have it run, you can, which is quite a long process just to get one build through. You can just make small tweaks, small changes, and it will automatically rebuild inside Razor's Edge, which is really nice. Very quick way of debugging. Before we do any of that though, and I should have rearranged this slide really, but anyway, before we do any of that, I would actually say just try ng build, just to make sure that your Angular builds. Because sometimes there's an issue which you don't sort of see. It doesn't have an error in the code, it doesn't have like a squiggly, but it just doesn't build properly, and it'll give you reasons why. Maybe you have a missing component, a missing resource, and then just try running it locally, npm start, to see if it starts or if there's any errors. Anyway, hopefully, after all you've got through all that process and you've got all that done, hopefully it'll work. And what you should see is something like this. So this is my tile. This is my record, position record, and this is my BBJS tile. Clearly, it's just taking the text from my server endpoint based on the ID of my record. We can go to Kimberly's record, which is a slightly different text, which we see there. On Kimberly's record, we can see that we shouldn't bother with her record, look at mine instead. And that's very much it, really. As I said, when you download these slides, you'll have access to the front end and back end links. But I'm very open to connecting with you. If you have questions, or to drop me a line, or just connect with me. Or if you have questions now in the presentation, please feel free to add them to the Q&A.
Sorry, that took a minute to load there.
Unless I'm looking wrong, I don't see too many questions just yet, but there we go.
One right now. Those on your screen, you want me to call them out?
I can see that. I mean,
okay, go ahead.
Well, so does this same approach for BBCRM or is it only for RE? Good question. So I have worked with BBCRM in the past, and I generally answer I do not know whether or not the type of tiles that you get in BBCRM are compatible or they work in the same way. I know that Sky API works with BBCRM, but when I looked back at that screen where I had the list of the locations where you could place your tile, I don't think that BBCRM was listed there. I might be wrong, and you may want to just check, but I don't think you can do that right now. But definitely reach out to someone who knows a bit more about it. I hope that answered your question. Okay, I'm just flipping between the chat and the QA just in case someone else put anything on the chat, but just some thank yous, which is nice. Thank you. I'm going to take the opportunity to soothe my throat. As I said, I'm very happy. If you want to connect with me, please do so. And if you have questions later on, and happy to answer them later as well. So just if you can't think of anything right now, or if you don't have anything specific right now, just drop me a line later.
All right, well, it doesn't look like more are coming in. We've got some nice call outs in the chat. Just a reminder to everyone, again, the documents are all located for you to download. It's the full deck that was shared. So you can grab the QR code that's on your screen right now or download those. We'll stay here so that you can grab those. And then, of course, I will share our survey so that you can give some feedback. There we go. That should be live for y'all. If you could fill that out before you head out. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed a great first day of BB Dev Days. Please join us again tomorrow, and on Thursday, there's a lot more sessions like this. And David, thank you so much. Great presentation.
Thank you very much for everyone for coming, and I hope there's been some help to you. As I said, feel free to drop me a line if you have any further questions.